Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Claffey, and you have found the In Between Callings podcast. So, what is this podcast going to be about? Well, if you were in a season where life looks different than you expected, a new job, a loss, a big change, or even a dream that finally came true, this podcast is for you. Here we're going to talk honestly about the in-between seasons of our lives and what Scripture teaches us about moving forward with faith. My name is Peter Claffey. And you may be wondering, am I qualified to give a podcast that's going to have a religious focus and is going to talk about life experiences and things like that? Well, I've lived a life, so I feel like I'm qualified to talk about life. I grew up as a Christian, so I have a background in the Catholic faith. I have been spending a lot of time the last couple of years from my Bible, and I really felt called to share some of my own life experiences. And one of the things that really resonated with me was this idea of, what do we do during the in-between times? And I think for myself, I have found those as times of great reflection and tremendous growth. But I think I just couldn't seem to find the right sort of series of outlets or things I was looking for to help propel my journey in the in-between times. So I decided to create this podcast after praying about it for quite a while and really see, what we can do to help other people get through the in-between times. And I think in a more expansive way, I think we're also going to look at, once we come out of those times, how do we not lose the habits or the forward momentum that we may have created during that time, which ultimately was what propelled us through. So each time we do this, we're going to look at some scripture passages. We're going to have some sort of grounding thoughts in there. And then, this first kickoff series is going to be 6 podcasts. My goal is to keep them right around 25-ish to 30 minutes. I know for some folks that are used to those quick hit social media pieces, this may be a little bit long, but I think that's really what's needed to get all the things that I'm trying to say in. So with all that being said, thanks for tuning in. Like, click, subscribe if you like this kind of content you're seeing here. And we are going to get into talking about today's message. And for this first one, one thing that I wanted to start off with was this idea about what grounds us, especially when we're in a period of uncertainty, right? Whether we've had a job loss or a relationship change or, maybe we've moved or we're in a new place. What grounds us, especially when maybe we've lost some of our old habits that kept us anchored, right? I think that's is really important, especially in these times, is, what's going to anchor us, what's going to keep us moving forward in a way that's purposeful, right? I think, we as people at times, especially in uncertain times, we can become, maybe one of two things. We either occupy ourselves with being just extra busy, right? We're going to do as many things as we can, a whole bunch of extra projects, and we're just occupying all our time. But, the work is not particularly purposeful. Or on the other side of the coin, we're going to shut down, right? Because we've faced a defeat, we've hit a challenge, and instead of, trying to work and move forward, we're kind of like, hey, I don't got this. This is a really difficult thing I'm trying to do, and I just need to center, sit still, and do that. And I think there's a time for all those things, right? I think when, losses quickly happen, we need to create that space to feel our feelings, but we do need to move forward, right? One analogy that a friend of mine shared with me years ago was, if you're trying to dig a hole and you're praying to God to help you dig a hole and you're leaning on the shovel, we're not really digging a hole. You're just kind of standing there. So, I think, in this space, we have to think about what's going to ground us, what's going to move us forward, what's going to give us sort of an anchor, something that's simple, right? That we can think about when we get to those times where either A, we're just taking on the world, B, we're not doing enough, or maybe even C, we have filled our time with all the distractions of our day, right? I think when we look at, today's time versus biblical times, we've got more information coming at us all day long, social media and emails and news feeds and so much stuff. It becomes so much noise and is so distracting. We've sort of lost that idea of just peacefulness, right? I mean, a long time ago, phones were on the wall and not in your pocket. People couldn't get you in an instant. And I think what that does is it creates this sort of self-perpetuating series of distractions. Then those distractions can then trigger our anxieties, right? And then as a result of that, we either become paralyzed or again, we start trying to do too much. So, one of the things that I was using, and I continue to use it for myself as an anchor point because I think it was just so simplistic. It's a good visual. It's one thing to think about is, in the Bible, we see that God asks Nehemiah in Nehemiah 6:3 to rebuild a wall, right? And as he's rebuilding the wall, people keep coming up to him. And they're talking to him, and they want him to come down, and they want to have an argument with him, and they want to delay him. They've got commentary to share. Maybe they just want to talk about what the day is like. And this response from Nehemiah, which is so simple, yet again, I think was so grounding for me, was this idea of, Nehemiah's response is, I cannot come down because I am doing a great work. And, again, very simple, but he can't come down. He's doing his great work. So I think when we're working through these times of uncertainty, instead of seeing it as I'm unsure of what I can do, I think you have to think about the process of figuring out what to do as your great work, right? And work in a purposeful way that moves you forward, that doesn't create, an excessive sense of anxiety or stress, even though we know transitions and changes are going to be stressful, right? But faith at the end of the day doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. I think for myself, growing up in the Catholic Church, as a youngster and maybe a young adult as well, I think I had this belief that, because I was a faithful person that, life was going to be easy, right? I love God and I'm going to church and I'm doing my thing and I don't know, that feels like, I should have a pretty easy run. And I think for a lot of years, where I was maybe at a distance from the church, it was because I was like, well, wait a minute, life turned out to be hard, right? These are not easy things that we do all the time, right? And I think when we look at that, right, we can look at, John 16:33, and Jesus says, I have told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I have overcome the world. So, I think a part of this also that this touches on is, are we taking on responsibilities that we shouldn't be taking on? And I think we probably do that all the time as people, right? We weren't really designed to live, 10 years out into the future. We were designed to live in today and to give that to God. Now, that doesn't mean we should live like tomorrow's never coming and do crazy things. That's certainly not what I'm advocating. But what I'm saying is, we need to work purposefully and in good faith in the days that we have and use wise and sound judgment really as we go forward, right? Because ultimately, as we look at this, faith doesn't cancel difficulty, and difficulty doesn't mean that God's not there, right? I think what we see more often than not is that when we're in that difficult season or we're in that trying time, a lot of times those are the times where our faith is tremendous, our beliefs are increased, God's presence is more focused in our lives, in the struggles, right? I know, at least for myself, during the best times and the high times and all of that, where life is going great, you're not necessarily taking that moment to pause and say, isn't this amazing? But during those difficult times, a lot of times you're like, boy, I'm just thankful for a meal today. I'm just thankful for a friend that checked in on me today. I'm just thankful that this relationship is still moving forward, right? And so I think, we really have to always have some intent and some purpose as we look at, our faith, and that really the road is not going to be so easy for us to walk down all the time, right? But I think the important part here is that we are going together, right? God is always present. He's always along with us on our walk. And, he wants to be there to support us like a good father would be, for any of us, right? And I think we see this sort of reinforced in Luke 9:23, where Jesus says, if any of you want to be my followers, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. It doesn't say take up your cross, here and there, whenever it fits in, if you don't have anything going on a Thursday. He says pick up your cross daily and follow me, right? And I think, that is one of those things that's very encouraging in a way, right? Is that, life is not going to be easy, but every day we can pick up and start anew, right? And I think, we would all be better off if we forgot the challenges and the struggles from the past every day, because every day is a new day, right? And I think that's where we see a lot of people get into these challenging patterns, right? Where we plant seeds of past troubles in our minds, and then, with the thoughts of how those things happened, we water and we fertilize those seeds. And a lot of times what we see out in nature is that when, plants grow in the same flower beds and things like that, we find that their root systems become very entangled in one another. So now that means if you're planting those negative seeds in your mind and they're now entangled in the positive seeds that you've also planted, you're counteracting the good that you're trying to do in your own self. So, I think as we think about how do we pick up our cross and show up every day, I think a part of that has to be is, yesterday is past. We can't fix yesterday. We can't fix last year. We can't fix 10 years ago. We can fix today, and we can work towards a future and have a vision for what that future really looks like, right? And that's not ultimately going to be an easy process, right? Either an easy process to figure out what that looks like, how do we get there? And we see this sort of over and over, as we look at it in the Bible. There's different versions of it. One of the ones that I like is Psalm 66, 10, 12, where it says, "You have tested us, O God, you have purified us like silver. We went through fire and flood, but you brought us to a place of great abundance." Again, it doesn't say we walked through a meadow and it was beautiful and the waves, lapped on a tropical beach and we arrived at a panacea of great things, right? Those are struggling things, right? We went through a fire, we went through a flood. Those are things that people don't always come out of, right? That are real tests. And we see this analogy early in this statement too, where it talks about, purified us like silver. We see that theme sort of over and over again in the Bible in different places, where we liken the process of man to a process of refining metal. And I think when you're sort of in that in-between phase, you have to get comfortable with that refinement, right? And if you've ever watched a blacksmith at a historic village or a town, the first thing that they do is they heat up a piece of metal and they just get it just cherry red hot. And then the next thing they do is they put on a heavy piece of steel, an anvil, and they take a really heavy hammer, maybe 10, 12 pounds, and they start pounding the heck out of it to make it from what it was into something new. So again, that process is not an easy process, right? It's not a process that one might say, oh, you're going to become new just like when you slip into a hot tub, right? And you're going to go from old to new and you're going to be transformed. That is not what the Lord promises us, but he does promise us that he'll go with us through that season, right? And I think a part of this also is that these things all take their own time, but there are also things that we can do that can speed up that time. Right? We can spend more time in prayer. We can spend more time reading our Bible. We can fast, right? Sometimes if you can fast, it brings you closer to the Word because you are giving up something in a meal, right? I know myself, I've spent some time fasting lately and have really felt like that has been purposeful and helpful. So I would encourage you, if you haven't done a fast, sometimes it's just, skip breakfast, have a light lunch, things like that, but really use that as fuel to take your spirituality along to the next level, and you're giving something up to really see that come to fulfillment, right? And which I think is really strong at the end of the day. God's not going to rush his refining season that he's going to bring us through, but he always brings us through it. But I think there's a layer of that too, that we don't want to become comfortable in that season. Now, we don't want it to be a season of shame, loss of a success, loss of a significant other, loss of a job, like a loss of a house, loss of a car, loss of finances. We're not called to live in a space of shame and to feel that we can't share that with others. Maybe somebody's dealing with an addiction and they relapsed, right? There isn't shame in those things. There's strength in those things, because at the end of the day, God uses all of those things and shows up during that transition, right? I mean, I think it's easy for us to walk when something is new and it's exciting and we feel really great about it. But it's harder when we talk about something that's ended, a season is closed out, and how do we share that with our friends? How do we share that with our family? How is that going to be received? How are people going to perceive me? And I think that's, just in our society today, and something that we see, over and over again in the Bible, is just this idea of comparison, right? And comparison creates lots of challenges. It creates shame and struggles. And I encourage everybody each and every day, we probably all do it. I know I've been guilty of it myself. Try to not judge others. And at the same cadence, don't judge yourself too harshly for the position you're in or the season that you're going through right now. This is a time when you're in between things to use your time wisely, to do your reset, to create your structure, to maybe rebuild some relationships, to, think about, what is God really calling you to do? And did he take away something that ultimately was not for your good, right? There's a couple passages in the Bible where it talks about God will remove you from the table where they will serve you poison. A little bit extreme, but I think you also have to think about that in the context of certain things that disappear, right? Was this not the place that you were meant to be? I think that's really important. I think it's tough for us when we had a perception that that was the place where we were supposed to be, and now we're no longer in that place. And I think it's interesting when you look at the Bible and you look at Peter, who became Jesus' number one man, the rock that he will build the temple on. But Peter was one that had a lot of anxiety. He sort of had some control issues. At one point Jesus called him, "O ye of little faith." So by no means is Peter sort of a layup at different points in the Bible, but he shows up. He comes through. He's strong. My namesake. Certainly. I can see all his steps along that path. But when we look at what Peter says, in his part of the Bible, in 1 Peter 5:7, he says, "Give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you." And that's something I think is really a hard thing to do. It could even be a hard thing to hear, right? Where we go, hey, wait, we live for control. We want to have a calendar that tells us, when to get up, when to do this, when to do that, where I'm going to be, check in with 27 different people. And at the end of the day, that's not what we were made for. And I'm not saying you should turn off your alarm, and if God wants you to go to work, he'll wake you up on time in the morning. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I am saying is there are a lot of cares that we carry with us, things that are long-term down the road, when we get trapped in those what-if scenarios, right, that can spin us out. And again, it takes us away from our great work, because now we're not able to do our great work because we're catastrophizing various scenarios in our mind. And I think that's especially common when we're in between different things, right? Because we've lost an anchor, we've lost that piece that grounds us. So we have to really think about what is going to help us see a path forward through this time, provide us with that strength, help us find, what our great works are going to be. And a great way to do that is really if you can, when these worries flood in and things take you over, just get in that space and say, give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you. He cares about you, and I think, Peter doesn't really talk to us about how to manage anxiety, but he tells us to release it, right? It's not ours to hold on to, and I think, again, what are we watering? How are we doing it? If we're watering faith and we're saying, hey, God, I give these things to you. These are my struggles. These are my challenges. I need you to help me take this forward. Then we're watering positive things, right? We're watering our faith, and we're uprooting those negative seeds that might be in there. So, as we get down to the last little bit of our time together today, one of the things that I think about that just kind of, ties it all together a little bit for me and gives us sort of an underlying theme, which we're going to keep working on here over the next 6 podcasts that I'm going to put together is, in Proverbs 3:6-5, it says, trust in God with all your heart. With all your heart. Not part of your heart, not on sunny days, not rainy days, not when it's happy, sad, all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Our own understanding. We only understand the experiences that we have, but God understands all experience because He is everywhere. Right? Seek His will in all you do, and He will show you which path to take. Again, all you do. It's not, hey, I'm making this one decision. I think I got this one. I can handle that. It's seek His will in all you do. So that's every decision. Big decisions, little decisions. Think about it. Is this the path that God wants you to take? And I think we see this over and over again in the Bible. And it's hard for us, again, because we want a roadmap. What does success look like? What is the 20-step plan to get me there? And God, He rarely gives us a whole picture. Maybe He gives us the next step. Right? We're going to go, we're going to go here. We're going to do this. Then we're going to do that. He's not going to tell you this is what this looks like, because there's a part of that if He explained it to you and you understood what it was, you couldn't believe that would happen. Right? You couldn't believe that the blessings and the layers that God has laid out for you are out there. And ultimately, this series isn't about having answers or coming to some great conclusions. It's really about putting out some ideas. This first podcast, I think, is really focused about how do we start to ground ourselves in our times of uncertainty? What kind of pillars do we want to stand up to support that? And then how do we use that, again, in these times of uncertainty, as well as the times when things are certain, when we are in a great space? Because, I think we see it, in Saul, in the Old Testament there, where, he won all those battles with God at his side. And then at some point he's like, well, I'm the king. It's really me and it's not him. And you go, oh, there we go. And then we see that whole thing goes downhill and David comes in and all of that. So, I think there's a part of that people forget, right? We need it in the struggle, but in the great times, it's not as present. And I think, what we're going to try to do in this next series really is learn that it's all about how to walk forward, walk faithfully, and make sure that walk always includes time with God and digging into our Bible. So what's on the agenda coming up? Well, like I said, we're going to do 6 of these. The next one is going to be learning when to wait and when to move. I'm going to try to keep all of these, again, around 25 minutes. If you've made it this long, you made it to the end. I appreciate you staying for this inaugural podcast. I think in future ones, I may have guests here. I may have others come in and share their stories that relate to this same idea. How did they handle a struggle in a transition? What resonated with them? And how might that help you in your journey forward? I'd like to thank you for coming today and listening to this. I'm going to say a quick prayer as we close it out. Dear Lord, I thank you for everyone that put in their time today to listen to the words that I had to say. I pray that you bless them with an abundance of listening and understanding, that you put something on their heart today from what I said that will help them grow in their journey. Lord, I have no words and you have all the words. I ask that you will keep us strong and blessed and keep us moving forward. Thanks again for tuning in. Have a great day.